The setting. New Orleans, 1800s. To understand Violet's world, we must step back into the streets of New Orleans in the early 19th century. Picture a city both beautiful and cruel. By day, merchants crowded the French market, selling sugar, coffee, and cotton. Wealth flowed through the city, and the elite boasted of their riches. By night, candlelight flickered through the grand homes of slave owners, where lavish dinners were served on imported china. Dinners cooked, cleaned, and carried by the enslaved. The air was heavy with contradictions. On one hand, New Orleans was famous for its culture, food, and music. On the other, it was built on the blood and sweat of enslaved Africans. And in the middle of this contradiction was Violet. Violet. The invisible hand's Violet was not born free. Like many enslaved women of her time, her life was already written for her by the system of slavery. She belonged not to herself, but to the household that owned her. She worked in the kitchen, the very heart of the house. Yet she was invisible. Guests saw the fine meals, the polished silver, the steaming pots of gumbo, but they never saw Violet's cracked hands, her sweat dripping into the fire, her exhaustion after endless hours. The kitchen was hot, suffocating, and unforgiving. Her day began before sunrise, grinding cornmeal, chopping vegetables, stirring pots so large they needed both strength and balance, baking bread for the table she could never sit at. And when the masters and their guests feasted, Violet often went hungry, surviving on scraps and burnt edges. But the kitchen gave her more than pain. It gave her knowledge. She knew every spice, every herb, every root. She knew what nourished and what killed. Chains in the kitchen life for enslaved women like Violet was brutal in ways often hidden from history books. They were not only workers, they were the silent property of their owners. Some faced abuse, punishment, and endless humiliation. For Violet, the kitchen was both her cage and her battlefield. The wooden spoon, the pestle, the pot, all tools of labor, could also become tools of rebellion if she dared. And dare she did. Whispers of Resistance. New Orleans was not just a city of masters, it was also a city of whispers. Resistance lived in the songs sung quietly at night, in the coded prayers, in the hidden gatherings of the enslaved. Some ran away into the swamps. Some fought with machetes in uprisings. But Violet's weapon would be different. She would use what no one suspected, the very food her masters trusted. Narrator's voice, suspense. The same hands that cooked their stews, buttered their bread, and poured their wine, could also season death into every dish. Violet's burden. Imagine the silence of her nights. After hours of cooking, scrubbing, and serving, Violet lay awake on a straw mat, her body aching, her spirit restless. She thought of freedom, of life beyond chains, of justice in a world where none was given. But day after day she saw only the cruelty of her masters. Every command barked at her, every slap of disrespect, every stolen moment of dignity built a fire inside her. This fire grew until it became not just anger, but vengeance. The kitchen as a weapon in those days, enslaved cooks like Violet had unusual power, though invisible to the masters. The entire household depended on her meals. If she refused to cook, if she ruined the food, or worse, if she poisoned it, she could bring the household to its knees, and so the kitchen, her prison, was also her only chance of freedom. A dangerous game, but poisoning was not simple. It was a dangerous gamble. If discovered, the punishment would be death, brutal, public, and without mercy. Yet history tells us of many enslaved people who risked it anyway. From Virginia to Louisiana, whispers circulated of cooks and servants who mixed poison into their masters' meals. Some used oleander leaves, others arsenic powder, some even crushed glass. In New Orleans, rumors spread like wildfire. servants whispering to each other about kitchen justice. The masters, paranoid, sometimes forced slaves to taste food before them. Violet knew the risks, but she also knew the taste of injustice. And one day the decision was made. Her vengeance would be served not with words, but with poison. Suspense builds. Let us pause here and feel the weight of Violet's choice. Every step she took toward the kitchen was now laced with danger. Every pinch of spice, every stir of the pot could mean the end of her life, or the end of her master's. Would she succeed in her plan? Or would she be caught, punished, and erased from history like so many others? The fire burned low in the kitchen, its orange glow dancing on the soot-darkened walls. Violet moved silently, her hands steady as she ground herbs in a worn mortar. To any outsider, she looked like an obedient servant, preparing spices for the master's supper. But in her mind a storm was brewing, one that no master could ever control. Each stroke of the pestle against the stone was more than a task. It was a rehearsal, a meditation on vengeance. She knew that if freedom could not be handed to her, she would carve it out herself, even if it meant walking through fire to do so. The city outside her kitchen walls was alive with noise. Carriages rolled over cobblestones, and voices filled the humid night air. The sound of laughter from the grand dining room echoed faintly through the wooden beams, a cruel reminder of the divide between those who feasted and those who labored unseen. Violet often wondered if these people ever thought of her, not as a pair of hands, not as a shadow in the kitchen, but as a woman with a heart that burned and a mind that remembered every cruelty. She doubted it. To them she was furniture, useful only when bent to their commands. But she remembered everything. The sting of insults flung casually at her, as though words had no weight. The slap across her arm when she accidentally spilled broth. The way the mistress of the house complained that Violet's skin made the kitchen look darker, as though her presence itself were a stain. The endless hours of labor, the blisters on her palms, the constant ache in her back. These memories were not small. They were bricks, stacking one by one inside her until she carried a wall of fury in her chest. And with each passing day, she thought of only one thing: how to strike back. New Orleans was a city of whispers. Violet had heard them all. In the marketplace where slaves ran errands, quiet rumors slipped between baskets of corn and sacks of flour. Stories of servants who had slipped something deadly into a drink, of a cook who had added an herb to the stew that sent her master to an early grave. Most were rumors, half-truths passed like folklore, but in them was a hidden truth. The kitchen was power, and those who knew how to wield it could turn a meal into a weapon. She began to study without anyone knowing. Every herb, every leaf, every powder she touched, she memorized. Some soothed the stomach, some cleared fevers, and others, if given in the wrong dose, could bring sickness, or worse. The world outside believed she was ignorant, incapable of thought beyond cooking and cleaning. That was their mistake. She observed everything. She listened when old women whispered cures in the marketplace. She watched when healers mixed tonics in clay jars. She knew where the roots grew in the marshes that men avoided, and she learned the difference between medicine and poison was nothing more than a question of quantity. The first time the idea truly took hold was not on a night of rage but of sorrow. She had seen a young boy no older than 10 whipped until his skin split because he dropped a pitcher. She had heard his cries echo into the night, and she had seen the way no one came to help him. The masters did not care. His pain was nothing to them. And Violet lay awake that night, her eyes open to the rafters, asking herself why the people who caused so much suffering should be allowed to live comfortably, while those beneath them bled. It was then she decided the time had come to act. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into months. She waited, watched, and planned. She could not act carelessly. One mistake and her life would be taken without hesitation. She had seen what happened to others accused of rebellion. Bodies hung from trees as warnings, whippings so severe that flesh turned raw, executions in the square where the whole community was forced to watch. Violet carried these images in her mind, not as deterrents, but as fuel. If she was to strike, it must be certain, and it must be final. She began with small experiments, hidden in plain sight. A pinch of a certain root added to leftover broth. She would leave it out for the stray dogs that prowled near the alley. Some nights they walked away unharmed. Other nights, she found silence where once there had been barking. No one noticed. Who would care about the life of a starving dog? But Violet noticed. She wrote it in her memory like a scholar with a pen, marking which doses caused which effects. She refined her knowledge, careful never to reveal her secret. Her masters remained oblivious. They tasted her food daily, never suspecting that the woman standing quietly at the hearth might one day hold their lives in her hands. Sometimes they demanded she sample the dishes first, a precaution against poison that was more habit than fear. She did so without flinching, because she knew which portions were safe. To them, it was proof of loyalty. To her, it was proof of patience. She would wait until the moment came when suspicion was impossible, when her hand could not be traced. Inside Violet's heart, the idea of vengeance was no longer a flicker, but a flame. It warmed her through the endless drudgery. It gave her strength when her body felt broken. She had something no whip, no chain, no cruel word could take from her. Purpose. The thought of her master's laughter turning to silence, of their power, crumbling because of the meals they trusted her to prepare, was the single thread of joy she held on to. She imagined their surprise, their disbelief, their fear when sickness crept over them. In those dreams, she was not a slave. She was justice. The world outside continued as if nothing was changing. Mardi Gras parades filled the streets with masks and music, while in the swamps, the cries of frogs and cicadas sang endlessly. The city thrived on trade, its wealth swelling from cotton and sugar shipped on great riverboats. Yet beneath all this prosperity was the truth that Violet and countless others lived and died in chains. She often wondered how the rich could blind themselves to the cost of their comfort. Did they not smell the sweat in their food? Did they not see the suffering in the eyes of those who served them? Or did they see and simply not care? Every time she stirred a pot, she saw more than soup. She saw a battlefield. Every spoonful carried the potential to nourish or to destroy. Every dish was a choice. She grew sharper, quieter, more deliberate. She practiced controlling her face so no expression betrayed her thoughts. To the family she served, Violet was simply their silent cook. But inside she was sharpening her blade, waiting for the moment to strike. The opportunity came closer than she expected one humid summer night. The master of the house returned from a gathering, flushed with drink and arrogance. He stormed into the kitchen demanding food. His voice was harsh, his words careless. Violet prepared him a plate, her hands steady as stone, though inside her chest her heart thundered. She knew she could end him right there. The powders and herbs she had hidden were within reach. One pinch and the balance would tip. She set the plate before him, and for a long moment she stood frozen, the line between life and death resting in her fingers. But she did not act. Not yet. It was not hesitation out of fear, but wisdom. The timing was not right. He was drunk, careless. If he died, then suspicion would fall upon her too quickly. She needed a stage where her hand was invisible, where poison would seem like fate, like disease, not rebellion. So she let him eat in peace that night, and she carried the knowledge of what she could do back to her small bed. It was a cruel thing. This waiting. Every day was another chain, another reminder of her captivity, but she endured it, because she knew patience was her sharpest weapon. And as she lay in the dark, listening to the crickets outside, she whispered to herself that her day was coming, the day when the kitchen would no longer be her cage but her battlefield, the day when the meal she served would not fill the stomach but empty the body, the day when Violet's vengeance would no longer be a dream, but a reality written in the silence of her master's final breaths. And so she waited, with the fire inside her burning hotter than the fire beneath her pots, waiting for the moment when she would finally, at last, serve her vengeance. The night was thick with humidity, the kind of heavy air that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like labor. Violet stood in the kitchen, her hands moving with the rhythm of routine, but her mind was sharp as steel. She had carried this fire long enough. The plan that once lived only in her imagination was beginning to take shape in the real world. Her vengeance would no longer be a distant dream. It was now a recipe, slowly coming together, ingredient by ingredient, moment by moment. She had chosen her tools carefully. Hidden in a small pouch beneath the wooden floorboards of the kitchen was her arsenal. Dried leaves, powders ground from roots, substances she had collected with the precision of a healer but the intention of a soldier. Each one was ordinary on its own, a harmless part of the natural world. But Violet knew their secrets, knew the exact measurements that transformed medicine into poison. She touched the pouch often, not to use it, but to remind herself of the power she held. It was her secret weapon, lying in wait, invisible to the world above. Her chance came when preparations began for a grand feast. The master of the house had invited guests, wealthy men and women who came dressed in silks and jewels, their voices loud with laughter, their eyes blind to the suffering that sustained their comfort. For Violet, this feast was the perfect stage. A single family's sickness might draw suspicion, but when many fell ill, the cause would seem natural. A spoiled ingredient, a sickness passed through the city, bad fortune. It could be explained away. And in that chaos her vengeance could thrive. She worked tirelessly in the days leading up to the feast. Every dish demanded perfection, every flavor had to impress. The kitchen buzzed with activity, other enslaved servants moving in and out, but no one paid her more than passing attention. To them, she was simply doing her duty, as always. But beneath her calm exterior, Violet's heart beat with dangerous anticipation. The moment was coming closer, and every time she lifted a knife or stirred a pot, she could almost feel the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. On the night of the feast, the house glittered with candlelight, carriages lined the street outside, and music floated in from the courtyard. Guests filled the grand hall, their laughter spilling into the kitchen as they toasted to their wealth, their future, their imagined greatness. They did not know that their evening of indulgence would carry with it a hidden note of destruction. They did not know that the cook who moved silently among them was carrying something deadlier than any weapon they had ever feared. Violet's hands trembled only once when she reached beneath the floorboards for the pouch. She felt the texture of the dried leaves, the faint bitter scent rising from the powders. For a brief moment, her mind flashed with the risks. If anyone saw her, if anyone suspected, her life would end in pain and shame. But she had carried fear long enough. Tonight was not for fear. Tonight was for action. She steadied her hands, drew a slow breath, and began to mix the hidden ingredients into the feast. She was careful, so careful. The quantities were small, measured with precision. Just enough to weaken, to make the body tremble, to sicken those who tasted. Not so much as to kill immediately. Such an outcome would be too obvious. Her goal was slower, subtler, a sickness that would creep in unnoticed and claim her enemies in silence. She sprinkled the powders into sauces, stirred them into stews, folded them into the bread dough. To any eye, it was simply seasoning, the touch of a skilled cook. Only Violet knew the truth that simmered within. When the food was carried into the hall, her heart pounded as though it might break her chest. She watched through the crack of a doorway as the guests raised their forks, tasted the dishes, and smiled. Compliments drifted back toward the kitchen. Exquisite, perfectly seasoned, a marvelous cook. They spoke of her skill, without ever naming her, without ever acknowledging the woman who had created their meal. Their words were empty, but to Violet they carried a secret sweetness. They were praising the very weapon that would undo them. The night stretched on with laughter and music. The guests drank wine and feasted, their joy filling the house like smoke. Violet moved silently between the kitchen and the hall, refilling plates, carrying trays, her face unreadable. Inside, however, she carried a storm. Every smile, every sip of wine, every bite of food was one step closer to the moment she had been waiting for. She had never felt such a mixture of fear and triumph, and then slowly the change began. At first it was small, a cough, a hand pressed to a stomach, a sudden silence in the midst of laughter. A woman excused herself, her face pale. A man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cool night air. Violet noticed everything. She saw the way unease began to spread across the table like a shadow. Glasses of wine sat untouched. Forks lingered in midair. The sound of laughter faded into whispers of concern. Within an hour, the grand hall of celebration had turned into a chamber of sickness. Guests clutched their stomachs, their faces twisted in pain. Some tried to rise, only to stumble back into their chairs. Servants rushed about in confusion, unsure whether the food had spoiled, whether an illness had struck, or whether something far darker was at play. The master of the house grew angry, shouting for explanations, but his own voice wavered as his face turned grey. Violet stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, her eyes cold and steady. She did not rush forward, she did not offer aid. She simply watched as the people who had lived their lives in arrogance and cruelty now bent beneath an invisible hand. For once, they were powerless. For once, they were vulnerable. For once, she was the one who held the strength. But vengeance was never simple. With every moan of pain, with every guest who clutched their stomach, Violet felt both satisfaction and a creeping unease. These were her oppressors, yes, but they were also human. She had lived in their world long enough to know their faces, their habits, even their small kindnesses, when they thought no one noticed. The poison did not discriminate between master and mistress, between cruel and indifferent. It consumed all who tasted, and Violet, for all her resolve, could not escape the weight of what she had done. Yet even as doubt flickered in her heart, another voice rose stronger within her. These people had never doubted the rightness of their cruelty. They had never stopped to question the suffering they inflicted daily on those beneath them. To them, her life had been nothing more than labor to be used and discarded. If their suffering now was the price for centuries of injustice, then so be it. Violet did not smile. She did not cry. She simply stood still, her heart hardened by the truth that justice was never clean, but it was necessary. The house spiraled into chaos as the night wore on. Some guests collapsed on the floor, others were carried to chambers to rest. The master raged and demanded answers, but his words slurred, his strength failing. Physicians were summoned, their remedies useless against the invisible poison working its way through the blood of every victim. The mansion that had once stood as a symbol of power was now a place of weakness and fear. And Violet, quiet and steady, continued her work in the kitchen as if nothing had changed. She washed dishes, cleared pots and wiped the counters, her face expressionless. No one suspected her. No one thought to look at the silent cook who had moved through their lives like a shadow. To them, she was still invisible. They did not know that the invisible woman had just struck them in their most vulnerable place, their very bodies. As dawn approached, the sounds of sickness echoed through the house. Violet returned to her small corner, her body exhausted but her spirit alive with a strange, dangerous energy. She had done it. For the first time in her life, she had chosen her own path. She had taken from them the one thing they had always denied her: power. She lay awake on her mat, the voices of the suffering drifting through the walls. She felt no peace, no joy, no sorrow, only the steady hum of resolve. The world had shifted, even if no one knew it yet. The woman they had called a slave was no longer their servant, she was their reckoning. And though the night had ended, Violet knew this was only the beginning. The mansion had fallen silent in the days after the feast, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of sickness, the heavy hush that lingers in a house where pain has taken root. Curtains were drawn tight, windows shut, and whispers replaced the laughter that once filled its halls. Guests who had been too ill to leave were scattered in upstairs chambers, groaning through the nights. Servants moved quietly, carrying bowls of broth, fetching cloths soaked in cold water, but their eyes revealed fear. No one knew what had caused the sudden wave of illness, and in the absence of answers, suspicion began to creep through every corner of the household. Violet continued her duties as though nothing had changed. She rose before dawn, lit the kitchen fire, and prepared whatever meals were requested by the mistress of the house. She carried trays to rooms where pale guests lay shivering, and she kept her expression blank when they recoiled from the very food she served. The air of distrust was thick now. Every servant was watched more closely, and masters tasted carefully before they ate. Some meals were left untouched altogether, the plates pushed away in fear that they too carried sickness. Yet, despite the suspicion that clung to the house, no one looked at Violet with accusation. She was too careful, too practiced at invisibility. For years she had played her role so convincingly that not even the thought of rebellion would cross her masters' minds. To them, she was simply a cook, a silent worker who had no life beyond the kitchen walls. Her very invisibility became her shield, and as suspicion spread among others, Violet walked through it untouched. But the sickness did not fade quickly. Some guests recovered after days of misery, their bodies weakened but alive. Others lingered on the edge of death, coughing, sweating, moaning in pain that no doctor could explain. Remedies were brought in, herbal teas, purges, prayers, but little worked. The physician spoke of fever, of bad food, of tainted air drifting up from the swamps. Each theory carried weight, but none carried certainty. And in that fog of confusion, Violet's secret remained safe. Still, the house itself was changing. The master, once so full of pride, grew paranoid. He demanded to know every ingredient in every dish, inspecting even the simplest bread with suspicion. He shouted at servants, accusing them of negligence, of laziness, of betrayal. He doubled the punishments for mistakes, his fear pouring out as cruelty. Violet bore his anger in silence, bowing her head, her face calm, even as his voice lashed her like a whip. She knew his fear was her victory, though she never allowed triumph to show in her eyes. But silence is never without cracks. Rumors began to spread among the enslaved, whispers exchanged in the quiet moments between tasks. Some believed the sickness was a punishment from God, a reckoning for the cruelty of the masters. Others suspected poison, though no one dared to say so aloud in the presence of authority. A few glanced at Violet longer than usual, their eyes sharp with questions they would never voice. They too knew the power of the kitchen, They too knew that the invisible hands that cooked could also destroy. Violet felt the weight of these whispers pressing in on her. She had chosen her path, and she did not regret it, but she understood that danger was drawing closer. It was one thing to poison the masters. It was another to survive in the days after. Survival required more than secrecy, it required mastery of appearances. And so she played her role with greater care than ever before. Her movements were precise, her voice low, her actions obedient. She let them see nothing but loyalty, nothing but quiet service. Inside, however, she sharpened her resolve. If suspicion ever fell on her, she would not crumble. As the days turned into weeks, the city beyond the mansion began to whisper too. Guests who returned home carried their illness with them, and New Orleans, a city of gossip and rumor, spun the story in 100 directions. Some claimed it was spoiled seafood, others said it was an outbreak of fever sweeping the quarter. A few muttered about curses, about the dark arts of those enslaved who carried roots and charms from Africa. The story grew like wildfire, but Violet's name never appeared in it. She remained a shadow, her vengeance hidden beneath the noise of rumor. Yet in the stillness of the night, when she lay awake on her straw mat, Violet felt the weight of what she had unleashed. She heard the groans of the sick drifting down the hall. She smelled the sharp scent of medicines boiling in upstairs chambers. She saw the fear etched on faces that once only displayed arrogance. Part of her felt satisfaction. It was the justice she had longed for. But another part felt the burden of her choice. She had opened a door that could never be closed. Once, poison entered the story. It lived forever in the memory of the house, a silent ghost haunting every meal thereafter. Her own body betrayed her at times. Some mornings she woke with trembling hands, not from guilt, but from the strain of carrying such a dangerous secret. One slip of the tongue, one misstep, and her life would end. She thought of others who had been accused of similar acts, dragged into the square, beaten, hanged, their bodies left as warnings. She reminded herself daily that her survival depended on silence as much as on her courage. The mistress of the house grew weaker with each passing day. Unlike some of the guests who slowly recovered, the mistress seemed unable to regain her strength. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollow, her steps faltering. She called for Violet often, demanding teas, soups, bread that might comfort her stomach. Violet brought them all without hesitation, careful never to show the storm inside her. She watched as the woman sipped cautiously, as though the food itself had become an enemy. And in a way, it had. The master grew restless with his wife's illness. He raged against the physicians, dismissed servants in anger, accused strangers of bringing curses into his home. His voice filled the house with fear, but beneath his fury was the unmistakable scent of terror. He was a man who had built his life on control, and now control was slipping through his fingers. Violet watched him from the corner of the room, her eyes calm, her hands folded. She knew what he did not. That control had already left him the moment he sat down at her table. Outside, life in New Orleans carried on. Markets bustled, music filled the streets, ships came and went along the Mississippi. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Tales of sickness spread through the city like smoke, and with them came a darker suspicion that the enslaved were striking back in secret. People whispered of poisons hidden in stews, of slaves plotting revenge in kitchens across the South. The fear was not unfounded. History had seen such acts before. But for Violet, this fear was her camouflage. In a city already ripe with rumor, her act was swallowed whole, disguised by the paranoia of a society built on chains. Still, she knew this fragile balance could not last forever. The more her masters weakened, the more desperate they became. Desperation made people reckless, and reckless eyes might one day turn toward her. Violet prepared herself quietly for that possibility. She rehearsed lies in her mind, explanations for every herb she used, every ingredient she touched. She learned how to control her breath, how to keep her hands from trembling when others watched. Every day was a test, and every day she passed, it walking the thin line between invisibility and exposure. At night, when she lay alone, she thought of freedom. Not just freedom from the kitchen or from the lash, but true freedom, a life where she could choose her own path without fear. She imagined herself walking through the streets of New Orleans as a woman, not as property. She imagined tasting food without thinking of who it might kill, imagined breathing without chains around her spirit. These dreams gave her strength, but they also reminded her of the truth. Freedom could not be dreamed into existence. It had to be taken piece by piece, risk by risk, step by step. And so Violet carried on, her face calm, her hands steady, her secret safe. For now. The house groaned with sickness, the city buzzed with rumors, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She knew the danger was far from over. In fact, it was only growing. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had already changed her story forever. The masters might still see her as a servant, as a shadow, as nothing. But Violet knew the truth. She was the storm they never saw coming, and no matter what happened next, the truth could never be erased. The air inside the mansion had grown heavier, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the sickness and fear that clung to every corner. Days passed with the same monotony of pain, coughing upstairs, groaning in the guest chambers, the endless shuffle of servants carrying bowls and cloths. But beneath that monotony there was a change, an unease that was no longer hidden. Eyes that once slid past Violet without notice now lingered on her movements. Whispers that once ignored her presence now fell silent when she entered a room. She could feel it pressing against her skin. Suspicion had begun to take root. It started with small things. A servant boy, hardly more than 12, had been sent to fetch water from the kitchen. When he returned, his eyes were wide, and he whispered to another that Violet's jars of herbs smelled too bitter, too sharp, not like the herbs they used in their own stews. An older woman scolded him, telling him to hush before his words reached dangerous ears. But words once spoken have a way of growing. By nightfall, the story had spread among the enslaved. That Violet's hands carried more than food, that perhaps she was the reason the house was sick. Violet knew these whispers would come eventually. She had prepared herself for them just as she had prepared every herb, every powder, every morsel she had laid before her masters. But knowing they would come did not make them easier to bear. Trust among the enslaved was fragile, and suspicion could turn dangerous quickly. It was one thing for the masters to suspect. Their eyes were blinded by arrogance. But if her own people began to doubt her, she would lose the only shield she had, the invisibility that came from being part of the crowd. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the courtyard, Violet found herself confronted. An older man, Samuel, who had worked in the stables for decades, stopped her as she carried a tray back toward the kitchen. His voice was low, his words careful. "You've been feeding them for years," he said, his eyes sharp and searching. "Never made 'em sick before. Why now?" Violet froze for a heartbeat, then lowered her gaze as though the question were too heavy to answer. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. "Food don't keep forever," she said finally, her tone soft, almost weary. "Sometimes the air spoils it, sometimes the water. Ain't always in our hands." Samuel studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Perhaps he believed her. Perhaps he only pretended to. Either way, he said nothing more and walked away. But Violet knew his question would not be the last. The masters, too, grew sharper in their scrutiny. The mistress of the house had become so weak that she rarely left her bed. Her skin was pale as milk, her lips dry and cracked. She called for Violet constantly, demanding teas to soothe her stomach, soups that might bring strength. But no matter what Violet brought, her body rejected it. Sometimes she sipped cautiously and set the bowl aside. Other times she clutched her stomach in agony afterward, groaning until the physicians returned. Each failure fed the master's fury. One night, as the house lay under a heavy storm, thunder shaking the windows and rain hammering the roof, the master burst into the kitchen. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. He slammed a hand down on the wooden table where Violet stood chopping vegetables. "You'll tell me what you've done," he roared, his spit flying, his voice echoing through the stone walls. "Every guest who eats here falls ill. My wife is wasting away, and you—" He jabbed a finger at her chest. "You stand here as if you know nothing. Speak, girl. What poison is in this kitchen?" Violet kept her eyes lowered, her hands steady. Inside, her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times, and now it was here. She lifted her gaze slowly, letting her expression show nothing but weariness. "Master," she said, her voice quiet, almost trembling, though she forced each word to stay even. "I cook what you tell me. Nothing more, nothing less. I taste every dish before it leaves this room. If there is poison, then it is in the air, in the water, in the sickness God sends. But it is not in my hands." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment the master only glared at her. Then with a curse he turned and stormed away, slamming the door behind him. Violet exhaled slowly, her hands shaking only once the door was shut. She knew he was not convinced, but for now he had no proof. And without proof, all his rage was only sound. The storm that night seemed to mirror the storm inside the mansion. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating faces twisted with pain, shadows that stretched across the walls like specters. Violet worked through the night, preparing broth, carrying water, wiping sweat from brows. She moved like a ghost herself, her feet silent, her expression unreadable. She knew that each day she survived was another day her vengeance lived, but also another day the risk grew heavier. In the days that followed, the fear among the enslaved deepened. Some avoided Violet altogether, stepping back when she passed, whispering behind her back. Others watched her with something like awe, as though they suspected and admired her in equal measure. A few, the braver ones, came to her quietly. A young woman named Ruth, who worked in the laundry, leaned close one evening as Violet scrubbed pots by the fire. "If it is you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "then I pray you don't stop. Let them feel what we've been feeling all our lives." Violet did not answer. She did not nod, did not smile, did not give Ruth even the smallest confirmation. But inside, a warmth flickered, dangerous but real. She was not entirely alone, yet the walls were closing in. The physicians began whispering too, speaking of food that must be cursed, of meals that must be tainted. The master ordered all dishes tasted in front of him before they touched his lips. Violet obeyed, swallowing spoonfuls with steady hands, her face calm even as her stomach churned. She had always measured her poisons carefully, enough to sicken, but not to kill outright, enough to confuse symptoms with fever. But each taste was still a gamble. Each bite was a razor's edge between survival and discovery. At night, when the house finally quieted, Violet lay awake with her thoughts. She wondered how long she could continue before someone demanded her blood as payment for their fear. She thought of freedom again, the dream that pulled her forward. Perhaps, she told herself, she would not have to stay forever. Perhaps when the time was right, she could slip away, into the city, into the dark alleys of New Orleans where no one asked questions. She had seen others try, though most were caught. Still, the dream burned bright. It was the only thing stronger than her fear. The mistress's decline soon became impossible to ignore. She wasted away before their eyes, her voice reduced to a whisper, her body frail as paper. Rumors spread through the city that the house itself was cursed, that no one who dined there left untouched by sickness. Guests stopped coming, invitations went unanswered. The grand halls that once rang with laughter now echoed only with silence and coughs. Violet knew this was the beginning of the end. The house was unraveling, and when houses unraveled, someone always had to bear the blame. She had lived her entire life knowing that in times of crisis, it was the enslaved who were sacrificed first. She prepared herself each morning as though it might be her last, her mind rehearsing what she would say, how she would stand, what lies she would weave if the noose tightened around her neck. But she also prepared in another way. Quietly, secretly. She began to gather small things, scraps of cloth, dried herbs, coins left forgotten in pockets she washed. Nothing that would be missed, nothing that would betray her if discovered. But together, they were seeds of survival, seeds of freedom. If the day came when suspicion became more than whispers, when the master's rage turned to violence, she would not wait for the lash or the rope. She would run, and she would run with more than just empty hands. The house, once so proud, had become a place of shadows. Fear hung over every room, suspicion poisoned every glance. And at the center of it all was Violet, silent, steady, her face unreadable. To the world she was still only a cook, only a servant. But inside, she was fire, she was storm, she was vengeance walking quietly through the night. And though the walls seemed to be closing in, though suspicion pressed tighter with each passing day, Violet knew one truth above all others. She had already begun to rewrite her story, and no one, not master, not mistress, not physician, could take that from her. Night in New Orleans was never truly silent. The soft hum of crickets, the distant wail of a drunkard on the street, and the faint sound of horseshoes clattering against cobblestones mixed together to form the city's restless lullaby. But inside the mansion where Violet lived and labored, silence carried a different weight. It was the silence of suppressed rage, of secrets waiting to explode, of a woman whose vengeance simmered as steadily as the pots she stirred. Violet moved, carefully that evening, her body tired but her mind sharper than ever. She knew that every day brought her closer to the moment when her plan would unfold, and she could not afford a single mistake. Her masters trusted her too much, and that was both her shield and her curse. The master of the house was growing increasingly paranoid. Rumors of slaves poisoning their owners were spreading fast through the city. Some wealthy families had already fallen victim. A prominent merchant had collapsed after dinner, his lips blue, his body convulsing before his horrified guests. Whispers said it was the cook who had slipped something into his soup. Another household had lost 2 young heirs in a single night, their mother wailing as the physician declared the deaths mysterious but suspicious. Slaveholders were on edge. Some forced their enslaved cooks to eat the first bite of every dish in front of them. Others dismissed long-serving slaves simply because they had lost the nerve to trust them. But Violet's master still believed she was loyal, perhaps because he thought fear alone was enough to keep her obedient. He never understood that fear had long ago turned to fire in her heart. That night, Violet sat by the dying embers of the kitchen fire, a small bundle hidden in the folds of her clothing. It was nothing more than a small pouch filled with powder, an innocent-looking thing that could be mistaken for flour or sugar. But Violet knew it carried the weight of life and death. She had gathered it with care, mixing herbs and substances she had learned about from whispered conversations with other enslaved women, from fragments of memory her mother had passed down, and from her own observations in the kitchen gardens. Some of the ingredients grew in plain sight, plants that wealthy white households planted for beauty without ever realizing their darker properties. Others had been quietly traded with field hands or even free black folk who passed through the market, slipping her what she needed in exchange for a loaf of bread or a kind word. She thought often about her mother, who had been sold away when Violet was still young. The only gift she left her daughter was knowledge about roots, leaves, and seeds, the kind passed down for generations, sometimes used for healing, sometimes for survival, sometimes for justice. Violet remembered her mother's words. The earth holds answers if you know where to look. She had carried those words in her heart through years of suffering, and now they were guiding her toward an act that might change everything. But even as she prepared, doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if the wrong person ate the wrong portion? What if suspicion immediately fell on her? She knew the consequences too well. Enslaved people caught poisoning were not just executed, they were made into examples. They could be hanged publicly, their bodies left on display as a warning to others. Some were burned alive. Others were torn apart by mobs who demanded blood for blood. Violet had seen enough brutality to know that if she were caught, her death would not be merciful. Still, the thought of living another year, another month, another day under her master's rule filled her with a different kind of dread. To keep serving him, to keep bowing her head while he barked orders, to keep watching him sip wine and laugh while she scrubbed pots with bleeding hands, this was a death of another kind. Slow, humiliating, endless. For Violet, risk was the only path left. The mansion was preparing for a grand dinner. Important guests were expected, business partners of her master, men who boasted about the wealth they built on the backs of enslaved labor. These gatherings were displays of power, where every dish was meant to impress, every glass of wine meant to seal alliances. Violet knew this was her chance. She could strike not only at her master, but at his circle of allies, men who saw her and others like her as nothing more than tools. If they fell, their downfall would ripple outward, spreading fear among the slave-holding elite. She planned carefully. Timing was everything. She could not act too early or too obviously. She tested her ingredients in tiny ways, mixing the smallest amounts into the scraps that stray animals sometimes stole from the kitchen. When she saw the results, an alley cat convulsing, a stray dog collapsing under the moonlight, her resolve hardened. The powder worked. She was ready. In the days leading to the dinner, Violet's demeanor was calm, even obedient. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow, following her usual routine, giving no hint of the storm brewing inside her. She smiled faintly when ordered, bowed her head when spoken to, and worked tirelessly from dawn until late night. Her master never suspected. To him, she was just another piece of furniture in the household, reliable, silent, and controlled. But within her, a quiet fire burned hotter with every passing hour. The night of the feast arrived, and the house glittered with a light. Candles glowed from chandeliers, music drifted from a hired violinist in the corner, and the smell of roasted meats and spiced stews filled the air. Guests arrived in fine clothing, their laughter echoing through the halls as servants hurried to take coats, pour wine, and carry trays. Violet stood in the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared the final touches. On the counter beside her lay the pouch, hidden but within reach. She had chosen the dish carefully, a thick, fragrant stew that would be ladled into bowls and passed around the table. It was hearty, flavorful, and perfect for hiding what she intended to add. She waited until the last moment when no one was watching. With a quick motion, she loosened the pouch and let the powder fall into the pot. stirring it swiftly so it dissolved into the bubbling broth. The smell of the stew masked any trace of bitterness. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She ladled the portions into bowls and sent them out, each step taking her closer to either triumph or destruction. As the guests lifted their spoons, Violet remained in the shadows, her eyes scanning the room. Her master laughed, raising his glass, unaware that the meal before him was laced with vengeance. The guests chatted, complimenting the rich flavor, praising the cook who had labored unseen for hours to serve them. Every bite brought them closer to Violet's justice. But Violet knew better than to show satisfaction. She kept her gaze down, her hands busy, as though nothing unusual was happening. Yet inside, her pulse raced, her breath shallow. She was watching history unfold in secret, watching power tremble in a way it never had before. The first cough was soft, almost unnoticeable. One of the guests dabbed at his lips, muttering about a strange feeling in his throat. Another followed, setting down his spoon, his hand trembling. Within minutes, the room began to change. Laughter turned to confusion. Smiles faltered. A man slumped forward in his chair, his face pale. Another clutched his stomach, groaning in pain. Panic spread through the dining hall as one guest after another felt the effects. The master shouted for servants, his voice thick with fear, demanding a physician, demanding answers. Violet stood still, her face expressionless. She had dreamed of this moment, imagined it countless times, and now it was happening before her eyes. Chaos reigned, and for once, it was not the slaves who trembled. It was the masters. Yet even in that moment of power, Violet knew she had to remain careful. If suspicion fell on her too quickly, her victory would be short-lived. She feigned confusion, rushing to fetch water, pretending to help as servants scrambled. Her hands carried trays, her voice murmured reassurance. But inside she felt something fierce and unshakable. For the first time in her life, Violet was no longer just a servant. She was the one holding power, even if no one realized it yet. The poison in their bodies was her rebellion, her declaration that she was not invisible, not powerless. And as cries filled the mansion, as men of wealth and authority doubled over in pain, Violet knew this was only the beginning. The mansion no longer glowed with laughter and music. Instead, it trembled with panic, echoing the groans of men who had believed themselves untouchable. Candles flickered as if shaken by unseen hands, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Outside, the city went on with its usual restlessness. But inside, chaos had taken root. Violet moved swiftly among the guests, carrying bowls of water, pressing cool cloths to fevered brows, and whispering empty reassurances. Her face was the mask of a dutiful servant, but her heart thundered with the knowledge of what she had done. Her master had collapsed onto his chair, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. He barked orders between coughs, demanding that someone do something, but no order could undo what was already working its way through his veins. For years, he had spoken to Violet as if she were furniture, less than human. But now his gaze landed on her with desperate hope, as though she alone could save him. The irony almost made her laugh, but she forced herself into silence, lowering her eyes, pretending to obey. She fetched a glass of wine for him, knowing even that small sip would only quicken what had already begun. Some of the guests accused the wine, others the meat. Still others muttered of bad air or witchcraft. Fear cracked their voices, turning them against one another as they tried to make sense of the nightmare. Violet listened carefully, saying nothing. The less she spoke, the safer she remained. Suspicion was quick to take root in such moments, and she could not allow even the slightest glance to settle too long upon her. The doctor arrived at last, summoned in haste from his nearby home. He hurried through the front door, his black bag clutched tightly in his hand, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Violet watched him kneel beside the master, pulling back an eyelid, pressing fingers against his wrist. The physician muttered, about fevers, about sudden illness, about food gone bad. He instructed servants to bring fresh water, to open windows, to cool the air. But Violet could see it in his eyes. He was baffled, frightened by the number of men who had fallen ill so swiftly. It was no ordinary sickness, though he dared not say it aloud. To accuse poison without proof was dangerous, even for a white man of medicine. The master groaned loudly, his face twisting as though invisible knives pierced him from the inside. His business partners, those who still had the strength to speak, cursed the house, cursed the food, cursed their fate. One man tried to rise, only to collapse to the floor with a cry that silenced the room. The sound of his body hitting the floorboards was sharp, final, like a door slamming shut. Violet turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Hours stretched into an eternity. Some men writhed in agony, others slipped into unconsciousness, their breaths ragged and shallow. Servants rushed about with bowls and cloths, their faces pale with fear. The mansion that had always echoed with command and control was now reduced to a place of groans and whispers. Violet kept her movements steady, refusing to let her hands betray the storm within her. At last, the doctor declared that 2 men had died, their bodies lifeless on the dining room floor. Gasps filled the air, followed by wails of disbelief. Death had crossed the threshold of power, dragging away men who had believed themselves safe behind wealth and status. The survivors looked upon the dead with wide eyes, their fear deepening. Some demanded to be taken home at once, too afraid to linger another moment. Others staggered into the night, leaning on servants or clutching their stomachs, praying to make it back alive. Violet remained behind, silent as always, cleaning the table where the feast had become a graveyard. She gathered plates and bowls, her hands steady, her mind racing. The master still lived, though barely, his body trembling as the doctor tried to ease his pain with herbs and tonics. He glared at Violet once, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But he said nothing. Perhaps he was too weak, or perhaps he still could not imagine that his loyal cook might be the architect of his suffering. That blindness was her greatest shield. The next day the city buzzed with rumors. Word spread quickly that a dinner of wealthy men had ended in death. Some said it was spoiled meat, others whispered of poison, still others claimed it was God's punishment for greed and cruelty. Enslaved people across the city listened with quiet hope, their hearts quickening at the idea that the untouchable had been touched at last. Among themselves, they spoke in hushed voices about the possibility that someone, one of their own, had dared to strike, but no one knew the truth. And Violet kept her secret close, speaking nothing of her role. The master grew weaker as the days passed. The physician visited daily, his expression grim, his hands fumbling with remedies that did little to ease the pain. The master's wife wept at his bedside, her prayers loud and desperate, while servants moved through the house like ghosts, fearful of what would come. Violet prepared his meals as usual, serving him broth and bread with quiet obedience. Each spoonful carried with it the memory of what she had already done, though this time she let the food remain harmless. There was no need to hasten his end. Time and suffering were already doing the work for her. But suspicion began to rise in the city. Other households tightened their grip on enslaved cooks, demanding tastings before every meal, threatening punishment for the slightest mistake. Some families even dismissed long-time servants, replacing them with new ones they believed were less likely to harbor grudges. Fear was spreading like fire, and Violet knew it would not be long before eyes turned toward her as well. Late one night, as she scrubbed the last of the dishes, she overheard 2 white men speaking in the hallway. They whispered about an investigation, about officials questioning who had been in the kitchen that night. Her name was not spoken, but her stomach tightened. She realized that her greatest danger was not the poison itself, but the whispers it left behind. If the wrong person decided to speak her name, her fate would be sealed. Yet Violet felt no regret. Even if discovery came tomorrow, even if her life ended in the flames of punishment, she had already taken something back. She had forced men of a power to tremble, to cry out in pain, to look into the eyes of death. She had shown them, if only for a moment, that they were not invincible. And she had given hope to those who had lived too long under chains, proof that the mighty could bleed. As the weeks passed, Violet began to notice something she had not expected. Other slaves in the city looked at her differently. They did not know for certain what she had done, but there was a quiet respect in their eyes, as if they sensed the fire in her soul. Some approached her cautiously, speaking in riddles, hinting at their own dreams of resistance. One young woman whispered of hiding seeds that could bring illness, another of slipping powders into drinks. Violet listened, but said little. She knew that too much talk could unravel everything, yet she could not deny the spark that had been lit. The master eventually survived, though he was never the same. His body remained frail, his voice weaker, his temper sharper. He looked at Violet with suspicion more often now, though he lacked the strength to replace her. He depended on her cooking, on her care, and that dependence gnawed at him. He had built his life on control, but now every bite he took reminded him that his life rested in the hands of someone he thought beneath him. Violet saw the fear in his eyes, and it gave her a quiet satisfaction, but she also knew her victory was dangerous. The city would not remain blind forever. Already patrols tightened, punishments grew harsher, and laws stricter. The poisonings had rattled the slaveholding class, and their response would be swift and brutal. Violet understood that her story was not finished, that her act of rebellion was only one wave in a storm that was still building. The question was whether she could survive long enough to see it crash. The nights grew heavier after the poisonings, thick with whispers that clung to the air like smoke. Every corner of the city seemed alive with rumor, each retelling of the supper more exaggerated than the last. Some said 10 men had died that night, others that the cook herself had been hanged in secret. The truth was smaller, but no less dangerous. 2 dead, several more scarred for life, and a trembling class of masters who for the first time had seen their own mortality in the hands of those they had enslaved. Violet moved through her days quietly, just as she always had, but she could feel the shift around her. The other servants in the mansion carried themselves differently now, their eyes brighter, their silences more charged. When they passed her in the hallway or kitchen, some lowered their gaze respectfully, others offered the faintest nods, subtle acknowledgments of something they dared not name aloud. She had become more than a cook to them. She was living proof that resistance was possible, even in a world where chains bound every hand. But the danger that followed her victory never loosened its grip. One morning, 2 city officials arrived at the mansion. Their boots thudded heavily on the floorboards as they questioned the master, then his wife, then several servants. Violet was called in last. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood before them, head slightly bowed, her expression the perfect mask of submission. The men asked her where she had been that night, what she had served, who had helped her in the kitchen. Her answers were calm, practiced, each one delivered without hesitation. She spoke of cleaning vegetables, of roasting meat, of fetching wine at her master's command. Nothing in her tone suggested rebellion, and nothing in her face betrayed the storm inside her. One of the men studied her longer than the other. His eyes moved across her hands, her apron, her face, searching for a crack. Violet felt his gaze pierce her skin, but she held steady, her breathing slow and controlled. At last, he muttered something under his breath and waved her away. She returned to her work with the same quiet grace as always, though her heart hammered until the men finally left the house. That night, Violet sat alone in the servants' quarters, staring at the flickering light of a dying candle. She thought about how close she had come to exposure, how one slip of the tongue could have ended her life. The memory of the men's suspicious eyes lingered, reminding her that survival was as much an art as resistance. To keep living, she would have to master both. Her master, meanwhile, had grown more bitter in his weakness. Once a man who commanded rooms with his booming voice, he now shuffled through his days like a shadow of himself. His coughs echoed through the house, his hands trembled as he reached for his cane, and his once cruel laughter had been replaced with muttered curses. Violet saw the fear in his eyes each time she entered his room with a tray of food. He tried to mask it with anger, barking orders, criticizing her cooking, demanding more wine or less salt. But beneath the bluster, his gaze always flickered with doubt. Did he dare to trust a single bite? Did he dare to swallow what she placed before him? And in that doubt, Violet found her power. She no longer needed to slip poison into his cup. The fear itself was enough. Every meal was a battlefield, every spoonful a reminder that his life was no longer untouchable. He was trapped in a prison of uncertainty, and she held the key. Outside the mansion, the climate grew harsher. Laws tightened, curfews for enslaved people became stricter, punishments more severe. Rumors of poisonings in other homes spread, some true, some imagined, and white families grew paranoid. They forced their slaves to taste food before it touched, their lips sometimes even making them swallow entire portions in front of guests. Trust was crumbling, replaced by suspicion that ate away at the foundations of their power. For Violet, each new rule and each new restriction was both a threat and a reminder of her success. The fear she had planted had spread far beyond the walls of her master's house. It was infecting the city itself, seeping into parlors and drawing rooms, creeping into the minds of men who had once believed themselves gods. But she also knew the backlash could fall hardest on those who had done nothing at all. Every enslaved cook was now a suspect, every servant a potential conspirator. She had struck a blow, but others would bear the scars. In the kitchen one evening, a young enslaved boy named Samuel approached her as she chopped onions. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said, "Miss Violet, they say you're the reason." She froze for a moment, her knife hovering in the air, then lowered it slowly. She turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "Don't say what you don't know," she replied. He nodded quickly, his eyes wide with both fear and admiration. Before he left, he whispered again, "If it was you, you did what we all dream of." Then he slipped away into the shadows, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, Violet lay awake on her thin straw mattress, replaying Samuel's words. She realized that her act had grown beyond herself, becoming a story that belonged to all of them. Whether or not the enslaved knew the truth, they wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it. Her silence had given them permission to dream, to imagine that the walls of their prison were not unbreakable. And that was a kind of freedom she had never expected to create. Still, Violet could not let herself grow careless. One wrong step could bring everything crashing down. She became more meticulous than ever, keeping her routines exact, her answers prepared, her emotions hidden. She smiled when spoken to, bowed her head when commanded, and kept her hands busy at all hours. She was the picture of obedience, and yet, beneath that surface, she was building something dangerous, a legacy of resistance whispered in the dark. One evening, as she prepared bread for the household, she overheard the master's wife speaking with a neighbor in the parlor. Their voices carried down the hallway, filled with worry and bitterness. "They are no longer safe," the wife whispered. "None of us are. If a servant can kill a master in his own home, what protection do we have?" The neighbor replied, with sharp certainty, "Fear is the only chain left. They must be reminded what happens when they rise against us." The words chilled Violet, but also steeled her resolve. She knew what was coming. More punishments, more control, more cruelty. But she also knew something else. Fear cuts both ways. The weeks turned into months. The mansion never returned to its old rhythm. Where there had once been laughter and wine, there was now silence and suspicion. Guests no longer lingered long at the dinner table, and the master himself rarely entertained at all. His health continued to falter, his temper souring with every passing day. He had become a man imprisoned in his own fear, a king without a crown. And Violet, the cook he once dismissed as invisible, was the invisible hand shaping his downfall. Yet Violet never allowed herself to forget the risk. Each morning when she woke, she wondered if it would be her last. Each knock at the door made her heart race with the thought that officials had come for her. But every day that passed without discovery felt like a small victory, proof that she had outwitted a system designed to break her. She clung to that thought, drawing strength from it as she continued her work. Sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of a different future. She imagined a world where she walked freely through the streets, where no one ordered her to bow her head or silence her tongue. She imagined cooking not for masters, but for herself, for her own family, in a home where laughter was not a weapon, but a joy. She knew such dreams might never come true in her lifetime, but she also knew she had planted a seed. And seeds, once planted, have a way of breaking through even the hardest soil. Violet understood that history would not remember her name. She would remain, to the world, a shadow in someone else's story, a nameless servant in the margins of records written by those in power. But she also understood something deeper. Her act had already carved itself into the memory of those who needed it most. To the enslaved who whispered in the dark, she was proof that even the smallest flame could set a forest ablaze. And so she carried on, silent and steady, her hands shaping bread, her eyes lowered, her voice soft. Outwardly, she was nothing more than a cook in a mansion that had lost its glory. But beneath that surface, she remained what she had always been, a survivor, a rebel, a woman who had dared to poison power itself. The rains came late that year, falling in heavy bursts that turned the dirt streets of the city into rivers of mud. In the mansion, the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Servants moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps soft against the creaking boards, while the master sat by the fire with a blanket over his legs, coughing into a handkerchief already stained with blood. The once proud man, who had towered over Violet with authority and cruelty, now seemed smaller, almost shrunken by the weight of his own fear. Violet watched him from the corner of her eye as she carried in his supper. Her movements were deliberate, her hands steady, even as the silver tray rattled faintly under the weight of the bowl and cup. She placed the meal before him without a word, her face composed, her eyes lowered. But inside, her thoughts twisted like the storm outside. Each clink of the spoon against the bowl, each cautious sip he took, reminded her that his life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her silence, to her control, to the quiet terror that lingered between them. Yet the walls of fear were closing in tighter on everyone, not just him. The city had turned into a place of constant suspicion. White families demanded to know the past of every servant they purchased, forcing questions about loyalty, about skills, about family ties. Cooks were watched most of all. Some households banned their servants from the kitchen entirely, bringing in outsiders to prepare meals, while others forced enslaved children to taste every bite before the master or mistress lifted their forks. Rumors swirled of brutal punishments, men whipped to death for a misplaced spice, women hanged on nothing more than whispers of poison. It was a new kind of war, and the battlefield was the dinner table. For Violet, survival meant adapting. She became more careful with her every step, never leaving food unattended, never allowing her hands to tremble. She worked harder than she ever had, cooking feasts that drew praise from guests, serving with grace that earned nods of approval. To the outside world, she was the picture of devotion, the perfect servant. But she knew that her mask was the only thing keeping her alive. Behind it, her true self lived quietly, biding its time, holding fast to the fire that had already burned so deeply. One night, as thunder shook the windows, Violet lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the whispers of the other servants. They spoke in hushed tones, their words weaving through the dark like threads of a secret fabric. Some talked about escape, about slipping away into the woods and finding freedom on the other side of the river. Others spoke of revolt, of rising up together, of taking what little power they had and using it to strike back. But most fell silent when Violet entered the room, their eyes flickering to her with a mixture of respect and fear. She did not ask for their silence, but she understood it. Her presence was reminder enough that possibility lived among them. Still, Violet knew that rebellion came with a cost. She had already seen the cost written in the faces of the two men who had died that night at the table in the hollow stairs, of their wives, in the trembling rage of her master. Every act of resistance carried with it the risk of fire, and when fire spread, it did not choose its victims carefully. If the others rose, if they struck too openly, they would all face the lash the noose or worse. Violet carried that truth like a weight in her chest, and yet she could not ignore the hunger in their voices. The enslaved wanted more than survival. They wanted to live. They wanted to breathe without fear, to walk without chains, to raise their children without watching them sold away. Violet understood that hunger because it lived inside her too, growing stronger each day. She began to wonder if the story she had started in silence might one day find its voice in others. Weeks passed. The master's health declined further, his body giving way to the sickness that had rooted itself deep inside him. His wife grew sharper, her words cutting, her suspicion aimed not only at Violet, but at every servant who crossed her path. She demanded constant reports, questioned every movement, searched every corner of the kitchen. More than once she cornered Violet with questions. Had she noticed anything unusual? Did the others speak of rebellion? Did she feel loyalty to the family she served? Violet answered each one with calm precision, her voice smooth, her eyes unflinching. She became as skilled in lies as she was in cooking, each word another layer of protection, but the truth was that the mansion itself was crumbling, not its walls, but its spirit. Where there had once been laughter, there was now suspicion. Where there had once been authority, there was now weakness. And Violet, moving through the shadows of the house, saw that weakness clearer than anyone. She fed it with her silence, nurtured it with her obedience, and watched as it grew into something that consumed the master's family from within. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of red, Violet stood in the garden with Samuel, the young boy who had once whispered his admiration for her. He had grown bolder since then, his eyes sharper, his voice steadier. "They're afraid of us," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the windows of the mansion. "More than we're afraid of them." Violet studied him carefully, hearing in his words the same fire she had once felt burning in her own chest. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said only, "Fear is a weapon, but it can cut both ways." Samuel nodded, but she saw the hunger in his eyes, the hunger to do more, to strike harder, to carry the story she had started into a new chapter. That night, Violet realized something she had not admitted to herself before. She could not control what her story became. She had planted the seed, but others would decide how it grew. Samuel and those like him were already imagining futures beyond her silence. Futures where fear was not just a weapon, but a revolution. Whether or not she lived to see it, she knew the story would not die with her. The storms passed, the air grew colder, and the master's health continued to fade. By winter, he rarely left his bed. He ate little, spoke less, and spent long hours staring at the ceiling as though haunted by ghosts only he could see. Violet continued her work without faltering, her hands preparing his meals, her voice offering polite answers, her face never betraying what she knew. The power he had once held over her was gone, dissolved into sickness and suspicion, and though no one spoke it aloud, every servant in the house felt the same truth. The master's reign had ended long before his body gave way. Violet knew she had not won freedom in the way the world might define it. Her chains remained, her days still dictated by others, her future still uncertain. But she also knew she had carved out a victory of a different kind, one that could not be measured in laws or papers. She had poisoned not only her master's body, but the very illusion of his invincibility. She had shown in the smallest of acts that power could bleed, that tyranny could tremble, that silence itself could be a blade. And as the winter nights stretched long and cold, Violet carried that victory with her, hidden deep in her heart, knowing it was not just hers to bear. It belonged to Samuel. It belonged to every servant who whispered in the dark. It belonged to the generations yet to come, who would one day learn that even in chains, the human spirit could strike back. The mansion still stood, the city still enslaved, the laws still unbroken. But something had shifted, something that could never be undone. Violet had proven that history's cruelest masters were not untouchable. She had lit a fire in the shadows, and though it burned quietly now, she knew it would one day blaze into something the world could not ignore. And so, as the candle burned low beside her bed, Violet closed her eyes and let herself rest. Tomorrow would come, heavy with work and risk and silence. But tonight, she allowed herself one small thought, one fleeting glimpse of the freedom she had already begun to carve. For in her quiet defiance, in the story she had started with a single act, Violet had already changed the world. The winter wind rattled through the cracks of the old house, carrying with it a kind of silence that seemed heavier than sound itself. The master had grown weaker, so frail that even the smallest movement made him wheeze with effort. Servants came and went like shadows, their presence muted, their voices hushed, as though the walls themselves might betray them if they spoke too loudly. Violet moved among them with quiet precision, her steps measured, her face a mask carved out of calmness. Every tray she carried, every cloth she folded, every candle she lit was another act of survival, another reminder that her life balanced on the edge of suspicion. But beneath the surface of that silence, something else had taken root. The servants no longer looked at Violet simply as one among them. They watched her with a kind of unspoken reverence, their eyes seeking hers for guidance, their whispers circling back to her name, even when she was not in the room. They remembered what had happened, even if no one dared to speak it aloud. They remembered the men who had fallen at the table, the way fear had seeped into the master's bones, the way Violet had carried on without flinching. For them, she was living proof that the impossible could be done, that the power that ruled over them was not beyond reach. Samuel especially carried this truth like a torch. He had grown restless, his words sharper, his questions bolder. He pressed Violet when no one else dared, asking her if she believed freedom could be taken, if she believed the house could fall, if she believed they might rise together. Violet listened to him, her face composed, her answers careful. She told him only that patience was its own kind of weapon, that silence was not weakness but preparation. Still, She could see the hunger in his eyes, the hunger of youth, the hunger that refused to be quiet. It reminded her of the fire she had carried years ago, the fire that had led her to take the risk that changed everything. In the evenings, when the household settled into uneasy rest, Violet would sit by the dim light of a candle and let her thoughts wander. She thought of her mother's voice, of the stories she used to tell about ancestors who had walked free, who had danced under open skies, who had sung songs without chains in their throats. She thought of the land she had never seen. The land across the ocean that still lingered in her blood, even if she did not know its soil. She thought of the children born into bondage around her, their eyes wide and wondering, their futures written before they even spoke their first words. It was, for them, she realized, that her silence mattered most. It was not enough for her to simply endure. She needed to carve a crack in the walls of power, a crack wide enough that others might push through. The master's wife, sharp-eyed and bitter, grew more paranoid with each passing day. She prowled the halls like a restless spirit, searching for signs of rebellion, snapping at servants for the smallest mistakes. Her suspicion fell hardest on Violet, who never faltered under the weight of her questions. "You've been quiet," she accused one night, her voice cold as the frost creeping at the windows. "Too quiet. What do you know that you're not saying?" Violet lowered her gaze, her hands folded neatly before her, and answered in the same steady tone she had always used. "I know only my work, miss, nothing more." It was the truth wrapped in a lie, and the wife, though unsatisfied, could find no evidence to break it. The longer the sickness consumed the master, the more the mansion itself seemed to wither. The grand dinners stopped, the visitors grew fewer, the laughter that once filled the rooms disappeared. In its place was an air of decay, a slow crumbling of a house that had stood for generations. The servants felt it, each of them moving through their duties with the knowledge that the foundation of their captivity was not as solid as it had once seemed. Power was shifting, though no one could yet see where it would land. And still, outside the mansion, the city roiled with fear and whispers. Stories spread of poisonings, of uprisings, of enslaved men and women who had vanished into the night and been seen no more. Patrols grew stricter, punishments harsher, laws tighter. Yet for every new chain, there was another rumor of someone who had broken free, of a household that had fallen, of a master who had died with suspicion on his lips. It was as though the very air was alive with tension, waiting for a spark. One evening, when the fire burned low and the storm outside howled against the shutters, Samuel came to Violet with a plan. His voice was low, urgent, his eyes lit with the kind of determination that could not be extinguished. He spoke of others who were ready, who were willing to act, who believed the time for silence had ended. He told her of routes that could lead them to freedom, of allies in the shadows, of nights when patrols were weaker. "We could go," he whispered. "We could all go. You could lead us." Violet studied him for a long time, her face unreadable, in the flickering light. She felt the weight of his hope pressing against her chest, the way it demanded something more than words, more than patience. But she also felt the weight of memory, the memory of what had already been risked, the memory of how quickly suspicion turned to violence, the memory of the lash and the noose. She placed a hand gently on his arm, her voice steady but heavy. "Freedom is not just in running. It's in surviving long enough to see it. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep the fire alive." Samuel looked away, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. He wanted more, she could see it, but he respected her enough to say nothing further. He left her there with the candlelight and her thoughts, his footsteps echoing down the narrow hall. That night, Violet could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the storm and the shallow breaths of those who slept around her. She thought of Samuel's words, of the hunger in his eyes, of the future he longed for. She thought of the danger, of the risk, of the blood that would almost certainly follow. And she thought of herself, of the path she had already walked, of the choices she had made. Was silence still her strength, or had the time come to let her fire burn again? The question haunted her in the days that followed, lingering in her every step, in her every breath. The master grew weaker still, his body wasting away, his presence fading into little more than a shadow. The wife grew harsher, her suspicion boiling into rage that lashed out at everyone around her. The servants watched, waiting, their lives balanced on the edge of uncertainty, and Violet, moving quietly through it all, carried the burden of knowing that the story she had started was no longer hers alone. It belonged to all of them now. The mansion's halls grew colder, the silence thicker, the tension sharper. And, somewhere in that silence, Violet realized the truth she had been avoiding. Whether through patience or through fire, whether in silence or in revolt, freedom was coming. It might not arrive in her lifetime, it might not be hers to hold, but it would come. The cracks she had carved, the fire she had lit, the fear she had planted, it would spread beyond her, beyond this house, beyond this city. It was already spreading, carried in whispers, in glances, in the unspoken unity of those who refused to be broken. And so, she kept moving, kept working, kept surviving. Every meal she served, every word she spoke, every silence she held became part of something larger, something that could not be undone. Violet had become more than a servant, more than a woman bound by chains. She had become a story, and stories once begun could never be silenced.